In this video, we're going to be going over some of the best removed hunter pet abilities. This will include abilities from vanilla all the way up to Dragonflight. And first up at number 10, we have Reflective Armor Plating. This was the pet family ability for Dire Horns from Mists of Pandaria all the way up until BFA. Dire Horns became tameable in patch 5.2 after hunters looted and learned the ability from the Ancient Tome of Dinomancy, which is a rare drop on the Island of Thunder. The Reflective Armor Plating ability was pretty handy since it could deflect all spell casts in front of the Dire Horn for 6 seconds. This was great at making them tank pets, and they could shrug off massive castable damage and abilities from enemy targets with this ability. The ability had a 30-second cooldown, which is actually pretty short considering how powerful it was. However, on closer inspection, the ability begins to fall apart a bit. First, it only protects the Direhorn pet itself and not its hunter master. Second, the spells must be cast in front of the Direhorn to be deflected, meaning the effect won't work if the target casts them from above, behind, or to the side of the Direhorn. While definitely useful in certain niche situations, going out of the way to farm the Taming Tome, taming a Direhorn, and then finding out its special ability is just that it can ignore a cast or two every 30 seconds isn't really that worth it. Hunters have their counter shot interrupt to interrupt a cast if they really need to interrupt something, and the Gorilla Pet family also had a Pummel interrupt and a silence ability for a while as well, which had an auto cast for a bit. However, since it is the same as the Warrior's Pummel, which is still very much in the game to this day, we won't go too far into this topic. With the somewhat lackluster support for reflective armor plating from the community, Blizzard decided to scrap the ability when they redid a ton of pet abilities at the start of Battle for Azeroth. Now, the Direhorn special family ability is just Gore, which provides the Mortal Wounds effect, which decreases healing received. It may sound dull and was implemented poorly, but the idea of a pet being immune to unfriendly casts, even for a brief period of time, certainly did lend itself to the tenacity spec of pets being the tank class of pets. Additionally, no pet ability like it has ever returned to the game, and a pet that couldn't be affected by nasty spells from the front was particularly useful in PvP. Aside from its niche uses, reflective plating armor wasn't really that dynamite, so we place it at number 10 on this list. Next up at number 9, we have the ability Wolverine Bite. This ability comes from the Cutting Pet talent tree and requires at least 12 points before it can be unlocked. Pet talent trees were added to the game in Wrath of the Lich King and continue to exist for another 4 years or so until they were removed with a complete talent overhaul at the beginning of Mists of Pandaria. Wolverine Bite existed for the entire duration of both the Wrath and Cataclysm expansions, and it remained almost completely untouched throughout that time. While mainly a simple DPS ability that does X damage and the damage that scales with the player, the Wolverine Bite ability is notable because it cannot be dodged, blocked, or parried. Not only was this far more of a bigger deal in the early days of the game, but this ability was particularly useful in PvP, in which opposing players usually did have a lot of dodge or parry and block with cooldowns. The Wolverine Bite had a 10-second cooldown, and could even be learned at level 30 at the earliest. The one major downside of the Wolverine Bite ability was that in order for it to be able to perform this attack, the pet must have landed a crit on the target first. So the Wolverine Bite is a proc ability that is dependent on the pet even landing a crit in the first place. Because of all this, Wolverine Bite really is limited to niches and gameplay. And since it's beholden to some prereqs, in the end, it's not more than a glorified DPS ability, albeit one that always hits. And at number 8, we have a tie, this time for 2 pet abilities that belong to the Ferocity pets, which are both Ferocity pet talent tree abilities. These 2 abilities are Lick Your Wounds and Heart of the Phoenix. Both of these abilities, like our previous entry, were added in Wrath of the Lich King and removed in Mists of Pandaria. What makes these 2 abilities special is that they return the hunter's pet to full health, but in very different ways. Lick Your Wounds allows the hunter's pet to heal itself for 100% of its health over 5 seconds, whereas Heart of the Phoenix ability returns a dead pet back to life. Both of these 2 abilities have several drawbacks, which is why they're on the lower end of this list. The most glaring issue is that hunters already have the Mend Pet and Revive pet abilities, so both Lick Your Wounds and Heart of the Phoenix can be thought of as superfluous. In Wrath, Mend Pet only costs 9% of the hunter's mana and has no cooldown, compared to the 3-minute cooldown on Lick Your Wounds. However, unlike Mend Pet, Lick Your Wounds could be toggled to autocast, and the pet would automatically use the ability when their health was low and dropped below 50%. Not the greatest change aside from not pressing one button, but it was a nice quality of life feature. The Revive pet ability in Wrath had a 10-second cast time and cost 80% of the hunter's base mana. This is opposed to the Heart of the Phoenix ability, which did not cost any mana on the hunter's part, and had an 8-minute cooldown. This ability even had a 10-minute cooldown when Wrath launched, so it couldn't be used in arenas, but it was reduced to 8 minutes in patch 3.3.3. Unlike Lick Your Wounds, Heart of the Phoenix could not be autocast, and even worse, it came with 2 preconditions. First, the player must be in line of sight of their dead pet to use a Heart of the Phoenix ability to revive them. So if the pet was behind a rock or fell off a cliff, the hunter could not instantly revive them. The second and more important issue was that when the hunter's pet died, the pet bar, along with Heart of the Phoenix ability, disappeared with it. Hunters had to separately and manually go into their spellbook and use the spell if they wanted to use it while their pet was dead, because you couldn't even put the ability on your cast bar without a macro either. And to top it all off, these abilities could only be used by the pet families in the Tenacity spec, which in Wrath of Lich King is limited to 11 pet families. Aside from those lists of grievances, it's easy to see why Heart of the Phoenix ability was pretty good. It completely bypassed the need for the hunter to have mana to revive their pet, as well as completely removing the really long 10-second cast time. And while we're on the topic of abilities that regen health, we also want to give an honorable mention to Carrion Feeder. This pet ability was from the Cunning Pet talent tree introduced in Wrath and allowed a hunter's pet to feed on a corpse to gain some health. The reason Carrion Feeder is an honorable mention is because in WoD, the Devilsort pet family got a very similar ability named Feast. Since these two abilities are practically the same, we can't really call the Carrion Feeder ability removed from the game, since it still effectively exists, just under a different name and spell ID. And at number 7, we have another tie. This time between Tailspin and Trample. Both of these abilities decrease the pet's target's casting speed by 50%. For Tailspin, this debuff lasted 10 seconds, and for Trample, it lasted 12. Tailspin was the unique pet ability available to the Fox family of hunter pets. The Fox family was added in Cataclysm, but the then new Tailspin ability only reduced melee and attack speed. Tailspin was reworked in Mist of Pandaria to match another pet family ability that was being added, which was the Goat family. Both the Tailspin and Trample abilities in the slow cast form only lasted for one expansion, which was Mop. As you can imagine, increasing spell cast time by 50% can be great when dealing with casters in PvP. Even better, the debuff duration matched the cooldown, meaning that these abilities could be constantly spammed to permanently reduce cast time, so long as the hunter's pet remained alive. Another factor that made these two abilities even better was that they were AoE abilities. Granted, the range of these spells was limited to 10 yards, but it's still better than a single target only ability. As you can imagine, a 50% cast low in PvP would just make casters quit the game. So Blizzard nerfed Tailspin and Trample to only slow casting speed by 10%. Speaking of nerfs, for the first year or so of Mist of Pandaria, the Tailspin ability was super overpowered because its debuff lasted for 30 seconds. However, this was later hotfixed to a 10-second duration. A 50% slow in casting speed is the same debuff that Shurok the Dead Watcher applies in the Akanai Crypts in Auchindoun. This boss is an infamous pug killer, and the fact that the same annoying ability was given to hunters in Mop shows how ridiculously powerful the Tailspin and Trample abilities truly were. Before we move on, we wanted to give two honorable mentions in this category. The first of these is Lava Breath, which was an ability of the Corehound pet from Wrath until Warlords of Draenor. While it did reduce casting time of enemies by 50% in Mob, and could be used from up to 30 yards away and had a 2-second shorter cooldown at only 8 seconds, it was only applicable on a single target and wasn't AoE, so we unfortunately had to dock it a little bit. Another similar ability is Spore Cloud, which belonged to the Sporebet pet family from Wrath to Mop. While functionally identical to Tailspin and Trample, it can only be used just outside of melee range at 6 yards, compared to the 10 yards of Tailspin and Trample. Here's a fun fact, the Spore Cloud ability is still in the game, I believe it's now a completely different ability that's a dispel, so we're going to equivocally say it was removed from the game. And at number 6, we have a 4-way tie. All 4 of these pet abilities silence or stun the enemy for 2 seconds. Not the longest time in the world, certainly, but a little stun can be quite handy every now and then. The first ability in this entry is Nether Shock, which is the special ability from the Netherray pet family. This ability interrupts spell casting and prevents any spell that's goal from being casting for 2 seconds. Nether Shock has a 40-second cooldown, which is not that long for an ability that's both an interrupt and a silence. Another nice thing about Nether Shock is that it had a 20-yard radius, so it could be cast from somewhat far away. Finally, in Wrath, Nether Shock also did a little bit of damage to the target, but this component of the ability was removed in Cataclysm, with the ability ultimately being removed from the game with the release of Warlords of Draenor. While we've mentioned that hunters have their own interrupt spell, and even another pet, the gorilla, with an interrupt spell during this time, a little extra silence and interrupt ability is always nice, even if it was for only 2 seconds. The next 2 abilities in this entry are identical in function. Both the Sonic Blast and Sting abilities stun the target for 2 seconds. These abilities were both added in Wrath with the introduction of the pet talents to the game. Sonic Blast is a special ability for the pet family, and Sting is a special ability for the Wasp family. Each ability also only saw 1 chain throughout their time in the game from Wrath up into Warlords of Draenor. For Sonic Blast ability, after Wrath the damage component of the spell was removed, so its only remaining use was as a stun. While the Sting ability was added in Wrath, it did some nature damage and reduced armor. This was changed to a stun to match the Sonic Blast ability in Cataclysm. The final ability comes from the Porcupine pet family and is called Paralyzing Quill. This ability is a 2-second incapacitate on a target. Unfortunately, incapacitate spells break on damage, so the usefulness of the ability is significantly reduced from what it could have been. Additionally, Paralyzing Quill has a cooldown of 1 minute. However, it also was an AoE ability, meaning it could incapacitate an entire pack of mobs. The Porcupine pet family and the Paralyzing Quill ability were both added to the game in MoP, and the ability was removed with the launch of Warlords of Draenor. In Legion, the Porcupine pet family was renamed to Rodent to include more animal types. We've lumped all of these CC abilities into this entry for 2 reasons. First, the debuff duration for all of these was 2 seconds long at the height of each of the abilities. Second, they can all be used as a proper or impromptu interrupt. We also have one honorable mention for this spot. The Serenity Dust ability belonging to the Moth Pet family, and even though it still remains under the same name in the modern game and is now just a dispel, we're going to claim that its original identity has been removed since Cataclysm and MoP, with the Serenity Dust ability essentially a copy-paste of the Nether Shock ability. Now we move on to the number 5 spot, which is quite a messy one. The Bad Manner ability was added with the Monkey Pet family in the Cataclysm expansion. The best way to explain this ability is to just read the flavor text in the spell, which says, hurls a handful of something special at the target, blinding them for 4 seconds. Rude. This isn't the first time we've seen poop humor from Blizzard, as WoW is well known for its famous, or probably more apt, infamous poop quests, which usually sees the player going through droppings of some kind for a quest item. In fact, there are so many poop quests in WoW, we even have a top 10 video on that topic, which can be found in the description of this video. Back from that tangent and returning to discussing this silent but deadly ability, the only downside to the Bad Manner ability is that the blind can be broken by damage, so the effect can be lost if the target has a dot on it. WoWpedia editor Bellicoy sums up this ability perfectly by saying, presumably the monkey is throwing feces. We're probably better off not knowing. What really made the Bad Manner ability smell bad was that the blind it induced was almost always bugged, meaning it acted more like a stun than a blind at times. We have another ability in this spot which is called Lullaby. Quite the jarring transition from poop throwing, but there we are. The Lullaby ability was added in MoP along with the Crane Pet of families. When used, it put the target to sleep for 4 seconds. Since the sleep effect also breaks from damage, we've also thrown in with the poop ability. Lullaby has a 1 minute cooldown, the same as the Bad Manner ability does. A 4-second CC is nice, but since the target can technically be snapped out of it at any time, we're placing Bad Manner and Lullaby at the number 5 spot on our list. And at number 4, we have a 2-way tie between Web and Venom Web Spray. In Wrath, the Web ability was added to spiders as their family special ability. It rooted the target in place for 4 seconds and did some damage. This ability becomes even better because it had a range of 30 yards, meaning a hunter could keep any foe far away with their spider while they pew-pewed them to death. The duration of this root was extended to 5 seconds in Cataclysm. The other ability, Venom Web Wrap, was the same ability but for the Sylphid pet family and also shared the changes as Web did. A range class that could root a target far away from them is a mainstay principle in WoW combat, and is particularly notable in mage gameplay as well. Allowing a target to never get within melee range with a spider web root truly is a major blessing for a ton of hunter gameplay, from dungeons to leveling to PvP. While the modern iteration of the Intimidation also stuns a target for 5 seconds, players in Wrath and Cata could use both abilities. Even though Intimidation only stunned for 3 seconds in Wrath, using both a web ability from a spider and then Intimidation could theoretically keep a target at bay for 7 or more seconds, which is a lot of time for a hunter to disengage or perform all sorts of other hunter shenanigans. While stunning players is fun, is there anything better than disarming melee classes so they're almost helpless in PvP? 2 abilities in our number 3 spot are here to help with that in a big way. Snatch was added in Wrath to the Birds of Prey pet family. It did some pet damage and disarmed them for 6 seconds. It also only had a 20-second focus cost and a cooldown of 1 minute. However, a 6-second disarm wasn't really that impressive in Wrath. You see, in Wrath, most of the classes had a disarm ability of 10 seconds. While a 10-second disarm may seem insane in modern WoW, in Wrath, pretty much all disarms were 10 seconds long. To combat these long disarms, there was a very popular weapon enchant called the Weapon Chain, which lowered disarm durations by 50%, which was basically required if a player wanted to PvP at all. So because of this, the real disarm duration Wrath was only 5 seconds for a 10-second disarm, and the Hunter's real disarm duration only lasted 3 seconds, not 6. A disarm 2 seconds shorter than average was considered laughably bad compared to just about any other hunter pets in Wrath, and so hunter disarms were never really used in Wrath. Things changed a lot when Cataclysm rolled around. First, while the damage part of the Snatch ability was removed in Cata, the disarm duration was buffed to 10 seconds to make it in line with the other disarms. Additionally, it was also made so the ability no longer required any focus, so it was essentially a free ability that cost no resources. Also in Cata, another pet got the same 10-second disarm effect, this time an ability called Clench from the Scorpid pet family. So in Cataclysm, not only did hunters have access to 2 10-second disarms, they could also now be used whenever they wanted since they had a 0 focus cost. This led to some wacky shenanigans in Cataclysm. For example, if the hunter's first bird of prey pet died and the hunter didn't have enough time or resources to cast Revive Pet, they could more quickly just summon a Scorpid pet and have access to another 10-second disarm. Also in Cata, the casting time of Dismissed Pet was reduced from 5 to 2 seconds and had a range increase from 10 yards to unlimited. This meant that hunters could disarm a player, dismiss their first pet, and summon a second pet to disarm the enemy player. And while this CC reduction is a thing, can you imagine enemy hunters theoretically being able to make you weaponless for 20 seconds straight? It's enough to make you shudder, or even drop dead if you happen to be on the wrong end of a bow or gun. While disarms are notorious in PvP, they can also be used in dungeons and raids, and essentially make a boss do very little DPS for 10 seconds, if the boss is only doing physical damage with the weapon, which is quite frankly simply absurd. It appears the madness of Deathwing Fight had gotten a hold of some of these wild devs in Cata, because what on earth could convince them to give hunters 2 10-second disarms? Whether it be trolling or very poor gameplay understanding, both the Snatch and Clench abilities are number 3 spot on this list, and for good reasons. And at number 2, we have a trio of abilities, all of which can revive players. Yes, that's right, hunters got revives in Warlords of Draenor, and had the choice of 3 to choose from. The first ability is called Dust of Life and was a moth pet ability. Next came the Crane's Gift of Chi-Ji, and finally came the Quillen's Eternal Guardian ability. All of these spells were exactly the same in WoD. They were instant cast, could be cast from 20 yards away, and had a 10-minute cooldown. When resurrected, the player had 60% health and 20% mana. Hunters being given rev abilities is sort of a flagship of bring the player, not the class. While other DPS classes such as Death Knights and Warlock Soulstones have a resurrect ability, at least their abilities actually make sense and fit thematically lore-wise. To make these abilities even more OP, they could all be cast while in combat. Previously, only Druids could do that with the Rebirth ability, and poor Paladins had to wait until Dragonflight to get a battle res in the form of Intercession. Even then, those abilities have a cast time and aren't instant cast. Instead, hunters just randomly got instant battle reses in WoD, something which had not been in the game before. Granted, shamans did have reincarnation and warlocks had soulstones before WoD, but these items worked on themselves. Warlocks did sort of have a battle res with the second rank of soulstone in Legion, but that was also after WoD. Well, you can imagine how crazy this ability is. Hunters could now res any friendly target as long as their pet was alive, making PvP a tough boss fight and a lot more easier, but thankfully only in Battlegrounds. And while it may seem like these battle reses came out of nowhere, they do make more sense when you think about Blizzard's pet ability design in Warlords of Draenor to make pet abilities give buffs to raids and groups, and even giving them bloodlusses, or heroes if you insist, with the Netherwinds and the Ancient Hysteria pet abilities. Battle resurrections, buffs, and bloodlusts are pretty much the bread and butter of raiding. And maybe Blizzard was trying to make amends with hunters because they felt so bad about tearing away so many interesting pet abilities from MoP. But let's be honest, most, if not all, of the buffs from pets in WoD were meh at best, and giving hunters a battle res was a mistake that was quietly removed in Legion. Hunters have never gotten another resurrection ability since then, even with the complete talent revamp in Dragonflight. Hunters aren't known to be the sharpest quiver in the arrow, and there's a reason the clueless dumb hunter who pulls an entire zone's worth of mobs in 3 seconds is a cliche that has survived as long as WoW has been around. And then Blizzard goes ahead and gives the guy the free battle reses. It's eye-roll inducing. Of course, this battle res situation was the only thing wrong with WoD, and the rest of the expansion had absolutely no problems whatsoever in terms of content and class balance. One final note before we move on to the number 1 spot is that technically the Eternal Guardian ability still exists in the game, but this Quillen ability was made to just revive the pet itself in BFA and not another player. So it hasn't completely been removed from the game yet, but we're breaking with the precedent because that's so cool and exciting and submersive, just like giving hunters battle reses or something like that. And finally, at number 1, we have the ability Dust Cloud. The name of the spell still exists in modern WoW, but it's an entirely different spell. In fact, the Dust Cloud ability has been redesigned 4 different times at this point, but we'll start in Wrath of the Lich King when this ability was at its zenith. In Wrath, the Dust Cloud ability was added as a special ability to the pet family Tall Striders. Its description from Wrath is, your Tall Strider kicks up an obscuring cloud of dust, causing all enemies within 10 yards to miss their next attack. Lasts for 8 seconds. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, but first, this is an AoE ability, which means it can target any mob that is more than 10 yards away from the Tall Strider pet. While it only works to make the target miss one attack, the debuff lasts 8 seconds, meaning it can be timed to fit certain thresholds and time windows. Finally, it only costs 20 focus and has an insanely low cooldown of 40 seconds. So, why is this ability so OP, you ask? It's because attacks include any type of damage, the spell hits or physical hits. This means it can be used as an interrupt of sorts. With a duration of 8 seconds and the ability being properly timed right, it can be a mass AoE preemptive disrupt and reduce the target's damage to 0 for a short time. In Old War, and a huge trash pack is coming your way with wide wiping casts, pop this bad boy and every cast is nullified within 10 yards of the tall bird boy. You can see how this is probably used to cheese some boss fights mechanics in both raids and dungeons, particularly if the boss is about to deliver a huge attack, like for example during a massive soak and there aren't enough players left alive. Dust Cloud activates, both miss the next attack, no big deal. This ability was just as useful in PvP. Seeing a player cast an ability that's going to one-shot you, Dust Cloud the target. The cast miss and you still have other interrupts. The Dust Cloud ability could be used in nearly all aspects of combat gameplay, and it did stack with other debuffs that cause the target to miss attacks, such as the Scorpion Sting ability hunters had in Wrath. The only downside to this ability is the fact that if the enemy under the Dust Cloud effect unleashes an AoE, it will only miss the first target it hits, but every other target will still be hit as normal. A preemptive interrupt combined with what is essentially disarm is such a potent combination that even when going from Wrath to Kata, when very few pet abilities were changed, the Dust Cloud ability was nerfed. In Kata, the ability simply reduced melee and attack speed by 20%. In Mop, it was changed again, this time to just weakened armor. And it was finally re-added in BFA, but just as a movement slow, and under a different spell ID and icon. If we want to get really technical, the root cause of this ability being so OP is because in the beginning of Wrath, spell hit rating had been merged into hit rating, which was now combined into one attribute called hit chance. This meant that spells that missed a target now showed up as a miss instead of resist. Since the Dust Cloud ability from Wrath just makes all enemies miss their next attack, it applies to both cast and melee damage. Whether this was an oversight or a bug they could do nothing about, the Dust Cloud ability remained in the game throughout the entire expansion. And when it was so OP it was removed that early in the game's history, you know it had to have been bad. Of course, none of this is factoring in other pet talents or hunter abilities which could further augment the Dust Cloud, such as the Longevity Rank 3 talent, which decreased the cooldown of pet special abilities by 30 seconds. To say the Dust Cloud ability in Wrath was OP is somewhat understated. And who could have thought that an AoE ability that combined a preemptive interrupt and allowed for damage mitigation made it to the top of this list of the top 10 best removed hunter pet abilities. Finally, we have one last honorable mention, which is the Rhino ability Stampede. This ability was a knockback ability, but since hunters already had disengage and were able to target their foes at a distance, we figured it was somewhat redundant. Of course, this was used extensively in PvP, especially near cliffs. And to make matters worse, it was also initially an AoE ability. However, a 15-yard knockback is nothing to laugh at, unless you count it as a gnome being punted. It was so overpowered that it was nerfed within one patch, with the knockback ability being removed entirely. We only gave it an honorable mention because they actually brought it back in Kata, but in a much more diluted form. Well, that does it for this video. Thanks for watching, everyone. Are there any removed pet abilities we missed that you're screaming at the screen for us not getting them? Tell us down below. Admittedly, this video is skewed towards offensive pet abilities, but that's because hunters are a ranged class and are more often squishy than they are tanky, which is why they sometimes have tanky pets in the first place. If you're interested in the subject, we have 2 videos which you'll find in the description of this video. The first is a video where we discuss the history of hunter pets from vanilla to mist, and the second is the most overpowered player pets in Warcraft, which surprisingly has a little double dipping with this video.